A warm welcome back to the Ethics and Society stage at this year's Cognition X Festival. My name is Andrew Straight. I'm the Associate Director of Research Partnerships at the Ada Lovelace Institute. We are a London-based research and deliberative body with a mission to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. I'm so glad for those of you who've joined us throughout the day today for these fascinating discussions we've had on topics like biometrics, on the COVID data divide, on social media regulation, queer tech. We're now very excited to have our final presentation for the day, but don't fret, there's a lot more to come in the days ahead. Before I introduce the moderator for the day, I did just want to quickly run through a few key logistic facts. Again, if you'd like to ask any questions throughout the presentation, please do so in the Q&A on the side, and we'll filter them up to our moderator to ask throughout the day. If you'd like to tweet about the event or about the conversation happening today, please do so and use the hashtag CogX 2021. It is my absolute pleasure to now introduce Carly Kine, the Executive Director of the Ada Lovelace Institute, who will present the opening remarks and some thoughts around our final keynote presentation today from our speaker, Can You Do Ethical Research in a Corporate Environment? I'll hand to Carly, be about 30 seconds with you until she's on screen, but thank you again so much and looking forward to the conversation.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Carly Kine, and I'm the Director of the Ada Lovelace Institute. Many thanks to Andrew for the introduction. I am super excited and proud to be here today to introduce our final keynote speaker of the day, Dr. Margaret Mitchell. And the title of this session is Can You Do Ethical Research in a Corporate Environment, which is, of course, a very current and, judging by Twitter's response to this panel, a controversial question. As many of you will know, the last decade has seen the rise of ethical principles deployed and generated by both governments and industry to assist in developing safe and responsible technology, in particular around AI. This movement has spawned a range of ethical AI teams within companies and AI research firms themselves, such as Google's ethical AI team. But Google's recent decision to dismantle the team raises inevitable questions about the future of ethics teams within corporations and the ability to research and study and develop ethical AI in a corporate environment. So today we're going to hear from one of the leading thinkers and doers in this space. Dr. Margaret Mitchell is a researcher working on ethical AI, and she's currently focusing on the ins and outs of ethics-informed AI development in tech. She has published prolifically over 50 papers on natural language generation, assistive technology, computer vision, and AI ethics. She holds multiple patents in the areas of conversation generation and sentiment classification. She was the founder and co-leader of Google's ethical AI group, and she formerly worked at Google AI as a staff research scientist. She was focused there on foundational AI ethics research and operationalizing AI ethics within Google. Before she joined Google, she was a researcher at Microsoft Research, focusing on computer vision to language generation. She was a postdoc at Johns Hopkins, focused on Bayesian modeling and information extraction. And she holds a PhD in computer science from the University of Aberdeen and a master's in computational linguistics from the University of Washington. We are really happy to have her join us today and present a keynote speech on this question of whether you can do ethical AI research in corporate environments. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat throughout. And once Margaret's finished her presentation, we'll have a conversation together and I'll have the chance to put some of those questions directly to her. So I'm hoping the CogX folk can add Margaret in, and I will hand over to her, to present her keynote presentation, and looking forward to discussing it afterwards.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much. And hello, and thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here. I'm really excited to be able to share some of my thoughts. My goal in this talk is to take a bit of a step back from the ins and outs of specific issues I've worked on in the AI ethics space and share how these pieces fit together as a whole to define how AI ethics can be operationalized in an organization. In light of the provocative prompt about whether one can do AI ethics research in a corporate environment, I'll be focusing a bit on answering that question and addressing some of the barriers to operationalizing AI ethics research. So for the given question in this session, can you do ethical research in a corporate environment? What is my answer going to be? Yes. It's maybe boring for what people wanted to hear. And I hope that answer doesn't bum anyone out too much, but is, I think, can be seen by the publication records of me and my colleagues and other people in the space working in corporations. It's definitely true that you can do ethical AI research. But there's a related question where the answer is a bit less clear. And that is, can you operationalize ethical processes in a corporate tech environment? So that means taking existing organizations and procedures in a company and augmenting them or changing them with processes that focus attention on human values and foreseeable benefits and risks of different technology. Although there is some evidence you can do this to some extent, and I'll talk about that, it's not yet clear that ethical processes can fundamentally change the way technology is developed for the long term when hard decisions are required, balancing the foreseeable risks in the future with marketable benefits at a specific launch date. So let me talk a bit about my ethical AI journey to explain the opportunities and challenges I've learned about in tech company settings. So the first major corporation I worked at was Microsoft Research. And at this time, deep learning was really starting to work. So convolutional neural networks, or CNNs in particular, were very successfully being trained to detect objects in a scene. And this motivated work that took this even further, going from simple object detection to descriptions of entire scenes. This is largely called image captioning. This was an area I had already been working on, but using the earlier computer vision models that didn't work as well. So of course, once the opportunity was there to work with a bunch of brilliant people at Microsoft Research on a deep learning approach, I really jumped at the opportunity. And while I worked on it, I learned about a technique from John Platt called multiple instance learning. It's not a deep learning technique, but it's a technique that fascinated me for a ton of reasons related to long-term thinking about how these models can be used. So in particular, it made the models a bit more transparent, as well as having a clear stage where you could back off to more simple language, or utilize structured language templates to generate language about what the model was seeing. I've worked throughout my career on language generation for people with different neurodevelopmental and neurological disorders. And the applications of this specific approach to describing images began exploding in my mind, right? So I have a bit of a different background and a bit of a different perspective. And this led me to working on fundamentally different problems. At the same time, to motivate image captioning, people were thinking about generating descriptions for people who are blind. So why do we care about this task? Well, potentially it can be used for people who are blind. But I'm someone who, if that is a motivation, wants to see if that actually works. So I naturally began looking at image description from two lenses. One was, what are the actual tasks that this modern deep learning work can help with? For example, if one foreseeable potentially beneficial task is creating descriptions for people who are blind, are the models that we're working on going to meet that goal? And two, if we do desire a beneficial outcome for our AI, such as providing descriptions for people who are blind, what should we actually be developing right now? The first lens might be called tech-centric, going from the math to what beneficial could happen. The second might be called person-centric, going from the beneficial goals we want to achieve for people in the future and working backwards from there to what we should be working on right now. So this gave me insight into what it meant to start taking basic research ideas and placing them in processes towards beneficial AI products. So first was defining the goal. what are the beneficial tasks we could create to help people in society? This is an imaginative task. It's a creative tasks. It's something that authors and playwrights and screenwriters are very good at doing, but maybe computer scientists generally less good at doing. And then second, sketching the hypothetical, outline at a high level the potential future models that can help reach the goals, and critically identify the harms and risks of a given beneficial task. So this includes things like dual use, technology developed for one thing but could be used maliciously for another. And then the third is, of course, do the work. So taking into account modern day state-of-the-art technology and where you would like to be for human benefit in the future, refine what you can work on right now. But one of the fundamental challenges to operationalizing something like this within a company is the organizational structure. So in a very cartoonish way, I have on the right organizational structure at a tech company that does research uses processes and procedures that are largely defined top-down. So leadership is in charge of the company, of the products that are launched, and the PR around the company. This defines at a high level what they would like from program and product managers, top-down. Program and product managers set up the processes useful for leadership to make launch decisions. And these processes are passed down to researchers to mold their work into the relevant processes in order to have their work considered for productionizing. But the flow I had in mind, which required long-term foresight towards beneficial AI products at the research stage, ran counter to this model. So in particular, while your research could be informed by the current products and PR, you also had to be thinking about the longer term products, the longer term goals. And there was no way for those longer term goals and this broader vision to be appropriately communicated upwards. So this could essentially amount to doing a ton of work towards something that would never come to be because you just could not communicate that whole picture. It's not your job to have the whole picture, generally. That's what leadership is for. But without the ability to talk through the larger picture, to minimally have a dialogue about it, it can be a barrier to having everyone understand or accept your research towards beneficial outcomes. The second corporate environment I had the privilege of working in was Google. Around the time I was joining, I was seeing some new research that had this same kind of foresight I had hoped for. So the sort of work that was being done clearly lent itself to long-term beneficial outcomes. And here I was able to work with an incredible coalition of people throughout the company who deeply cared about development that was diverse and inclusive, and creating models that would not be problematically biased or propagate harm. And one of the things we ended up doing was breaking down development into specific components where different kinds of problematic bias comes in. And it was in doing this that I began to understand how to operationalize AI ethics in current organizational structures, or so I thought. So the key was to figure out general protocols that can be used largely within the existing organizational structures, essentially setting norms for development so that bottom-up research working towards beneficial long-term goals could just more naturally be integrated into the development pipeline. So it wouldn't matter so much if there wasn't a ton of communication back and forth. The organizations themselves would have the processes where ethics-informed development would shape what the company produces. And this begins to get to the heart of my recent research on operationalizing AI ethics. So I'm going to dig into this a little bit. I'll probably skip through the slides rather quickly so we can ask questions and stuff about it. But I think it would be useful to sort of get everyone on the same page of what we're talking about when we're talking about operationalizing AI ethics. So in general, in an AI development pipeline, first you collect the data, then you train and test a model, You add additional post-processing, such as selecting among a ranked list or applying thresholds, and then people see the output. But before the process even begins, the data itself encodes a subset of human perspectives. So data is biased because it is a snapshot of the world. It is not all of the world. And so we see biases like reporting bias, which is selectively sharing only specific kinds of information. So think about how often people announce that they are breathing. It happens a lot and no one talks about it, right? But we also see effects like racism and sexism expressed throughout, reflecting basic human behavior. And these biases then have a ripple effect throughout the rest of model development, as the training data itself is the only information that a supervised machine learning model can learn from. It's very limited. Other kinds of human biases are then layered on top of this and injected into model development by the choice of the model, the choice of the objective function, how the model is evaluated, and these choices persist the rest of the model lifecycle. So for example, there's a strong default effect, which is going with whatever is default for a general model and assuming it's appropriate. So this happens in model architecture choices, this happens in optimization choices, and it's particularly in applied context that we really see this. There's a similar effect with anchoring bias, sticking with what you're familiar with. Human biases are further injected into post-processing. These are the kinds of biases that you need to pay attention to the outcomes, the situations, the context that things will be used in. And that means you have to do additional work in development to think through the ways that the model can affect different people. And this is a place where risk and harms analysis is really key. Finally, once a model is deployed, people see the output, begin to act on that output, and that serves as further data that a model can then be trained on. And I like to call this bias laundering, where the final model or system can have all kinds of ethical issues, and it can be difficult to pinpoint the exact sources that cause them. I also like to call it bias laundering because it allows me to use this animation I personally made and I'm very proud of. So the data set defines what we care about for the model. The default approach is to simply use the training data that's available in a specific data set and evaluate on the evaluation data that's available, usually in the same sort of data set. And so if critical aspects of the problem space aren't represented in the pipeline, then deploying the model means you are making the value judgment, whether you're thinking about it or not, that these aspects shouldn't be represented. So if the data, training, post-processing creates models that disproportionately underperform on some populations or harm some populations, you're implicitly making the value judgment that some populations should receive worse performance or should be harmed. This is why awareness of the benefits and the harms and the risks is key to development. So machine learning development is not value neutral, and I don't think that should be revolutionary, but it really seems to be not part of current thinking. And what this means is that we have to think critically about the values encoded throughout the development if our goal is to advance ethics-informed artificial intelligence. So this brings us to the role of ethics in AI. Ethics doesn't provide an answer. It provides frameworks for analyzing problems in light of different human values. So some example human values are shown on the right, and these are exactly the values that can be incorporated not only within a development pipeline, but within the development culture more broadly. And having a basic understanding of the major ethical theories can help us learn how to articulate and justify our decisions. So I'll dive a bit into what this means driving the production of AI systems. I'm not an ethicist by training. I'm a computer scientist who applies ethics. So I'll give a bit of a description, but take it with a grain of salt. And broadly speaking, there are four main families of ethics. The two that are most important in the context of companies and organizations is normative ethics and applied ethics. Normative has to do with defining standards, norms, things you will and will not do. These are what provide the tools for ethical analyses. Applied ethics is basically those ethical theories in practice and within ethics-informed development. And this corresponds to organizational ethics, essentially. So one of the key ideas here is that we all have different senses of morality. Different cultures prioritize different values. But when we're working within an organization, these values need to be defined at the organizational level, providing a common ground of values that employees can build off of, create models around, and develop launch protocols based on. So there's often a question of whose ethics? It's quite simply answered, it's the organization's ethics. And how does the organization define the ethics? This can be defined by culling together values from different sources. Different companies may decide to prioritize different ethical values. And this can be seen as a business differentiator. Different companies with different ethical values. And that's whose the ethics, that's whose ethics that developers will be working with. So normative ethics is sort of a vehicle for operationalizing ethics within an organization. There's a few different types. In the context of applied ethics, employees would largely follow a deontological ethics, so doing what their company has told them, which is ideally informed by both virtue ethics, so doing what is good, and consequentialism, how things will end up. So turning again to this pipeline where I earlier highlighted how different problematic human biases can be propagated and amplified, we similarly see related kinds of ethical considerations. So collection of data includes concerns about copyright, consent, fair pay, diversity. Model training includes how appropriate different decisions are in light of the foreseeable effects of the model. And then in post-processing, values include consideration of trade-offs and aiming towards fairness of outcomes. So let's further examine what ethical values mean within the data stage. Defining values in data collection and annotation is one of the most pressing issues in technology currently. Let me say this again. Defining values in data collection and annotation is one of the most pressing issues in technology currently. Questions of who owns the data, whether it can be deleted, what sort of profit or benefit can be derived from it come into play. So one of the key solutions is operationalizing ethical data development. And here we put out some research on just how to do that, cited at the bottom. Further evidence that you can do ethical research. But for operationalizing ethical data development, that means defining the values up front, constructing data specifically based on those values, and that massively expands the current processes that are utilized within corporate tech structures. This can be seen as a life cycle for the data as a whole. It requires continual monitoring and analysis of the effects of the data. And these processes can ideally augment existing processes, but we're not quite there yet. So now let's talk about model training in a way that's informed by ethical values. So I'm going to share some thoughts on this via a case study. I had the opportunity to work on a coronavirus forecasting model. And we quickly found that there were a mass amount of model-based decisions that could drastically affect people when the model was deployed. So for example, false positives in coronavirus forecasting, a false positive error, means that deaths are over-predicted. So hospitals might be over-equipped, expecting a need for more beds, more ventilators. A false negative, not predicting deaths, means that there would be less resources than needed, which would end in death or could end in death. And there are trade-offs in both kinds of errors, but if you do the benefit risk analysis, arguably a model that tends towards false positives is preferable to a model that tends towards false negatives. Better to be over-prepared than under-prepared. And one of the issues at play here is the choice of loss function. I realize this is not a heavily mathematical audience, so I'll just sort of quickly summarize to say that the loss functions being developed don't take these trade-offs into account generally. It's sort of this default effect where you use what's known, and they tend to use absolute values, meaning false positive and false negative are not even distinguished. So that means that you're conflating those two kinds of errors as being equally problematic. Moving on to some of the post-processing and final evaluation. In this stage, concepts like fairness, diversity, and inclusion are important. Some of these are more developed than others. So let me talk about fairness in particular, which is the most developed. And one of the most basic ways that fairness in AI can be understood is as different errors in a confusion matrix. So we'll see here false positives and false negatives, as I mentioned earlier. False positives is where the ground truth, the reality says something doesn't exist, and yet it's predicted. False negatives are where the ground truth says it exists, and it's not predicted. I'll just say everyone who ever talks about this still needs to look this up because it's so easy to forget for some reason. And in some contexts, a false negative is much more problematic given the foreseeable use in contexts. So that helps you understand how to train the model and how to evaluate it. So for privacy in images, false positives are generally better than false negatives. A false positive means something that doesn't need to be blurred gets blurred. A false negative would be something that needs to be blurred not being blurred, which could end in something like identity theft. On the other hand, false negatives might be preferable to false positives in something like spam filtering. False negative, spam is in your inbox. False positive, a good mail that you want goes to your spam filter. But note that the usage and context still really matters here. So different populations will have different contexts and different considerations. So for example, if foreseeable users include those that are easily scammed, leading to a loss of wealth, then false negatives have greater risk. And model development needs to balance the different populations in determining those optimal models. There's so much more to say here. It's been like my research for the past 8 years or whatever. But the punchline is that considerations of each of these factors can inform ethical launch protocols of what eventually is released. So here's some steps forward. Number 1, to ground the considerations of how well a system works, basic values can be used as a backbone to guide what matters. Establishing these within an organization helps handle the issue that everyone has different moralities and different senses of what is right is wrong, different senses of what is right and wrong. And we can borrow a lot of ideas from ethics in doing this. Number 2, establish intentional processes throughout the pipeline where each stage has a variety of owners and stakeholders. And for this, I discussed the development life cycle and error analysis. And number 3 is that it has to be incentivized to do all of this within the development culture. And that means things like higher performance ratings and promotions when these processes are done well. So not just launches, but how it was launched, as well as norms across different companies to work towards a kind of greater good shared amongst tech generally. This is one of the areas where diverse and inclusive perspectives really come to bear. So diverse decision makers will be diverse kinds of future beneficial technology. Different people will think of different beneficial technology. And different people will see different kinds of harms and risks. So as we incentivize ethics-informed development, we naturally create a more diverse and inclusive atmosphere, because now we're thinking deeply about what benefits are there. Who knows? Who are all the people we could ask? What are the gotchas? What are the potential harms? Who knows? What are all the things we can ask? Suddenly we care about what happens to people and how people act. And now this means social scientists matter just as much as computer scientists. So one method that I've worked on to capture a lot of this and slot it into existing organizational processes is model cards. And broadly speaking, model cards provide a framework to share the ethical values at play in your system. It's intended to be shared transparently alongside a system or model in order to explain what that model is and how to use it, who it will work for, who it will not work for as well. And everything I've talked through comes into play to basically be summarized and shared with consumers so that they can understand when a model will work well and when it won't work well, what it should be used for and what it won't be good for. You can think of this as something between nutrition facts and a terms of service. Ideally, it's a card that can be put together based on the documentation from the ethics-informed processes throughout development. And this includes critical thinking about the foreseeable benefits, harms, and risks of how a model or a system might be used. And after all of this work, here was the ultimate barrier. Unfortunately, as has been shared heavily in the press, my former co-lead, Dr. Timnit Gebru, was said to be resignated for working specifically on harms and risks. Understanding harms and risks is fundamental to all of the processes I've discussed, and it's critical for research within a tech company to look at what these are in order to advance ethical AI. In the situation with Dr. Gebru, this specifically meant due diligence on a fundamental technology common across all tech, not a product, but a type of technology, language models. And there's been general agreement across the tech industry that something like model cards is quite useful. The punchline is that there are maybe some critical pieces that are off the table, at least for now. This brings us back to the same issue I mentioned at the start. The organizational blocks in place are such that researchers like me and Dr. Gebru couldn't share this bigger picture. We couldn't share that this was relevant to model cards. We couldn't share that language models were something that people were going to create model cards for, and so needed a source of harms and risks. For years, I've operated on integrating into existing processes and methods for advancing ethical AI, but I still didn't change the fundamentals of organizational structure. We need to do harms and risks analysis as part of the larger picture, as well as demonstrating, for example, that we can self-regulate. We have to be able to do due diligence on basic harms and risks. But if motivating and explaining the larger picture is off the table, then we can end up in a terrible spot. So, can you do ethical research in a corporate environment? I've hopefully shown yes. This is all based on research I've done. But whether all of the ideas can be taken seriously enough as a whole to complete the full picture, considering benefits as well as harms and risks and foreseeable uses, that remains to be seen. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I'm hoping we can both be back on the screen now. There you go. I should look that way so that we're looking at each other. Thank you so much. Incredible presentation. I feel very lucky to have witnessed it, and as will the rest of the audience members, because that was truly a primer and a very detailed one in what is ethical AI. Not only can it be done in corporate research environments, but how to do it at a very detailed level. And I really appreciate how much depth you went into. So many questions, 10 minutes to ask them. I want to begin by seizing on something you talked towards the end of the presentation around diversity, and in particular diversity in terms of thinking through not only what beneficial products might be developed and thus, from your person-centric model might give birth to the development of models, but also diversity and thinking about harms and impacts. And I just wondered do you think it's sufficient for computer scientists themselves to think through what might be the negative harms and risks as well as the benefits? And if not, how do we build in more kind of participatory processes? Have you seen anything good working in practice? And do you have any ideas about how to do that?
Yeah, so no, it can't and shouldn't be left up to computer scientists, and it shouldn't be left up to specific subpopulations. So tech tends to be male dominated, and obviously men will have different thoughts in general than women about benefits and risks. And I think, as I mentioned in my talk, once you start thinking about users, about people, about contexts, suddenly you need to know about society. And that's not something computer scientists generally know about, right? So you need to start bringing in people who understand how people work. Psychological, people who have psychological backgrounds, people who have social science backgrounds and sociology backgrounds. Suddenly this becomes just as important as the computer science work. So absolutely this needs to happen. It's still a bit of a battle. At Google, we were able to hire the first social scientist, research scientist. Wow. It took well over a year or two of motivating. But, this is the kind of thing that needs to happen. It needs to be clear why, and it's not quite there yet, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And it was also struck me when you're talking about the bias issues and the ethical issues which arise at the training data stage. And, you listed there consent for data collection as being a relevant issue that needs to be considered when you're thinking about ethics in the round. And, I think as a lawyer, this is something that particularly appealed to me, which is how could a researcher themselves satisfy themselves that data had been collected conceptually? That feels like a very lengthy process to go through on its own, or at least one that would require maybe some knowledge of the legal framework in the particular jurisdiction that the data is being collected. So that type of thing feels like it in itself requires quite a diverse range of people in the room.
Yeah, and foresight about where regulation is going, right? So, as GDPR first came out, suddenly we were thinking a lot about these sort of longer term legal trends, but we didn't have general legal scholars. We had Google lawyers specifically interested in protecting the company. And that's very, very different than an understanding of what regulation and laws are coming through and what they actually mean for development. So yeah, absolutely. At each stage, as you bring this in, there's all of these different stakeholders, all these different people that really need to inform what's happening. Yeah.
You said towards the end of your presentation that critical pieces are off the table. And I wondered to what extent do you think the current structure within companies really puts business model or kind of productivity and products above ethical research? And I don't mean particularly in Google, I just mean generally in corporate structures. I noticed from the Wired long read that was published last week, and I know had various problems, and please let me know if this is one of them. They talked about performance reviews that you underwent, kind of labeling you as uncollaborative, and it strikes me. Do you want to correct that for the record then?
No.
It's true. No, okay. I wasn't sure.
We don't incentivize ethical processes.
Right. That's what I wanted to ask you. Can ethical AI research, is it supposed to be collaborative, or is it supposed to be acrimonious? Should there be challenge in the system? And if so, how can ethical AI researchers be collaborative?
Yeah. So, this also, I think, this answer sort of intersects with my gender. There's actually a few questions. So one was around sort of companies generally prioritizing ethics over potential profit. And the other one was around, I guess, incentivization within things like performance reviews. So to the latter, I'll say that why this was your uncollaborative thing was particularly ridiculous was because I was working across the entire company, integrating into all of these processes, talking to hundreds of people. But when I was leading something, then people got territorial. Then it became your uncollaborative. And that's something that you see for women and not men, right? So a woman leader is bossy and uncollaborative. A man leader is like a great leader. So this is like something that was like particularly bonkers to me. But that is happening, right? That's something that is currently actively happening in tech. So that means performance reviews are already just all kinds of messed up in terms of prioritizing the right things.
Yeah.
In terms of companies and ethics, you know, it is going to really depend on the company. I think more and more critical ethical thinking is a kind of business differentiator. I also think the market is asking for it more. And even within a company, you know, different organizations will prioritize this more. So for example, I worked with Google Cloud, and they were awesome at thinking about this stuff. But then within research, I mean, as has been shown, not so successful. So it really
do you have any explanation for why they treated it like? There's a question in the chat about how you incentivize a company to prioritize it. Is there any reason why one part of the business was more open to that research than others?
You know, different people. Different business models, you know. People in research leadership have been there for a long time, and that sort of propagates the same way of thinking. Cloud was rather a bit newer, sort of newer people, and that maybe modernized some of the thinking, and that's obviously a factor. You know, there's a lot of different factors at play, but by thinking about it, we can, you know, address this in the appropriate way.
Absolutely. It's such an interesting observation that being a woman was also impacted how this information was received. And it's an observation you can't help but make, that there are lots of the leading thinkers in this space of ethical AI, and not only women, but they're often Black women as well. And I think that tells us quite a lot. There's quite a few people in the chat just saying what an inspiration you are to them. And I wanted to make sure that you heard that and really took it on, because you clearly really are pioneering the way. I wondered what advice you would give to junior researchers, particular computer scientists moving into this space of ethical AI. And in particular, you know, if they're entering a large corporate firm, what should they be doing? What types of challenges should they be expecting to face? How do those differ from academia, for example? And you know, what might be some strategies for forging ethical practices?
Yeah. I mean, I think this goes back to what I said about organizational structure and communication. So as a PhD student, you're used to getting back and forth, right? You talk to your advisor, you say, I want to do this, and they say, no, you should do this. And, you know, you have a back and forth. You hopefully get into sort of healthy debates. Maybe you convince them. There isn't as much of a sense of hierarchy as a PhD student as there is within a corporation.
Right.
And so if you're in a position where you're working on fundamentals of ethical data development, for example, by working with a lawyer, and you can't say that, right? And you can't tell the people above that that's happening and why that matters, specifically because data is going to be more and more regulated, and it's within the interest of your business to pay attention to this. If you can't express that, then it will just be shut down. There's no back and forth, right? You're like, no, I'm trying to help, listen, but you know, you can't really like send that message upwards. So that's really the main barrier as far as I see it. And yeah, in terms of what current students coming into tech should do, that's really difficult for me to answer right now. I thought I was doing everything right. And so I think maybe I don't know the answer to that right now, unfortunately.
I was interested to see that Dr. Gebru said that she's trying to set up something external to industry, working on ethical AI research. I wonder what you thought were the pros and cons of that. And I mean, clearly there is a real question around access to products, access to data, access to models, and an influence that feels quite stymied if you're outside industry. So you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I mean, it may be that both approaches are necessary, but I wondered what you thought about that idea of doing this type of research outside industry and what the potential is for influence that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I guess maybe you're making a distinction between industry, academia, and government, or maybe something like this. I mean, I'm sort of loosely interpreting industry to mean something profitable.
Yeah,
things that are profitable. And everything else maybe is not profitable.
Right.
So obviously industry is always going to have a very big, you know, impact on things. And, you know, I think many people would argue that's very important. But yeah, in terms of the other sides of it, without a profit model, it is harder to get funding. So this is where things like taxes come in. This is where things like charging potentially, well, it's hard to say charging users if you're not industry. Yeah, I mean, basically, if you don't have a source of funding, then you can't fund sort of new research and initiatives. So, I mean, there are lots of institutes that have been set up with donors and philanthropists and things like that. And that's the direction that Dr. Gabru is going in, really trying to say, government has maybe surveillance applications, industry has maybe surveillance applications. Maybe there is something that's not that, and that's ideally with philanthropists.
Right.
And so, I mean, that's sort of something to think about in terms of what you do with your own money, what you do with your own funding. And it also suggests maybe there should be some sort of profit model, or at least basic, not for profit, but at least keeping things running along model.
Like a public infrastructure model.
Right.
I guess I'm also interested in the potential for external research to influence companies like Google. To what extent do you think that, to the extent that leadership are going to take into consideration ethical concerns, they have to come from within versus coming from outside the company? Have you been able to see the effect of external researchers on companies, or do you think having that internal challenge is really key to making leadership listen?
They're both key. And I think this is also tied up with who the people are. So people who are very aware of things like harms and risks are people who have tended to be harmed, right? And so this tends to be marginalized populations. And then obviously there's a culture that is marginalizing, so is not listening to as much, like not bringing them to the table. And so one of the ways that me and Dr. I keep trying to call her Dr. Gabru, even though I always think of her as Timnit, but so one of the ways that me and Dr. Gabru went was publishing externally. Right. Because then once it was external, it was like something real. Internally saying the exact same thing. Right. Externally as a paper, suddenly it was, real and really paid attention to. So we need, both in place, basically.
And leveraging that external exposure is really important from a reputation perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We have to wrap up, but I'm going to ask one more question if that's okay. Which is, so some Dana Boyd and others at Data and Society coined the term ethics owners to describe individuals like yourself within organizations who have the job of owning ethical research. And I just wonder what your reaction is to that as a term. Do you think it's a positive step in the right direction to have a small group of people responsible for ethics?
Yeah.
How do you make that work in large firms, for example?
There's a comedy show in the UK called like W3 or
W1, I think. Yeah.
It's like kind of boring name where there's like this odor of values or something. It's kind of like ridiculous a little bit. I definitely think there's a role for ethics champions, or I would say people who are very good at thinking with foresight with human values. Ownership, I think, starts to get into things like territorialism and politics a little too much, and can also have some of the effects like in that show where like no one's paying attention to it, and then it's like this one person's job to save everyone, right? So it does. I kind of push back against that, but I do see a role for people who are particularly expert in human values and in long-term thinking.
Great. And I hope there's also a place for a TV show about an ethical AI team in a big tech company, because I think that would be wonderful. Margaret, thank you so much for your time and your insight. Just an immense amount of inspiration and enthusiasm and energy, and it was really, really thrilling to hear about your work. So we really appreciate having you here and
thank you
coming
so much.
along.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
And I'll hand back over now to Andrew, who's going to wrap us up for the day and say goodbye to all of the hardcore hangers-on who are still with us.
Thank you so much, Carly, and thank you so much, Margaret. That was a fantastic conversation. Some excellent points raised there. I want to thank all of you so much for tuning in today, the first day of the CogX Ethics and Society stage. Don't fret, there's 2 more days full of events on a range of different topics, including things like anti-racism and AI research, improving the trustworthiness of AI systems in health and care, AI and discrimination, diversity in tech, AI governance, geopolitics, and so much more. All of that will begin tomorrow at 10 a.m. On the hop-in link. We'll see you there. I will flag that I think there were just some very excellent discussions that came up today, that I just want to pull up 5 key themes that really stood out. So the theme for this year's CogX event is, how do we get the next 10 years right? And across the conversations we had today, I think we saw a couple points that hinted at directions or requirements for the next 10 years to be perhaps a bit more positive than they have been in years past. First was, in our discussions on vaccine passports, there was a really interesting notion about the importance of providing equal weight to non-technical solutions to complex problems, not rushing into developing shiny new technical infrastructures that may come with unforeseen issues or potential downstream costs. The discussion of biometrics and social media platforms highlighted the need for strong and thoughtful regulatory safeguards that take into account those who are affected by technologies as early as possible in their design and development. And the importance of inclusion also came up as a concept in our data divide conversation, highlighting the importance of acknowledging how the data divide between different demographics must be acknowledged when developing and rolling out new tech. Similarly, discussions on queer tech and the history of AI, curated by Hatuzia, highlight the importance of centering human integrity in the design and integration of various AI systems. And finally, Dr. Mitchell's excellent keynote highlighted that it's essential for corporate labs to think critically about the values encoded throughout the development process of their tech. Firms must not just implement harm and risk assessments throughout the development lifecycle, but for those to actually work, they have to be incentivized by leadership and by that firm. I think that was one of the clearest messages that came through. And I hope those things give us a sort of guiding path on some of the ways we need to improve over the next 10 years in the AI and tech ecosystem. I want to thank all of you so much again for spending the day with us today. We'll see you 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. My wonderful colleague, Alice Thwaite from Hatuzia, will be emceeing the entire day. But thank you so much again, and have a lovely, lovely night. Take care.